put in this proposal to tell you the history of the Access Conference, and then I realized in 15 minutes that's a ridiculous thing to take on. So I'm going to tell you the history and the future of the Access Conference. But the problem is that my content, my subject includes this conference, so I can't really start until it's over. So, yeah, okay, fine. So, starting with the Duke of Wellington. The history of a battle is not unlike the history of a ball. Some individuals may recollect all the little events of which the great result is the battle lost or won, but no individual can recollect the order in which or the exact moment at which they occurred, which makes all the difference as to their value or importance. And when casting my mind back over the accesses I've been to, my first one was 99, I think. It is hard to tell them apart and to put them in order and make sense of them. I got into librarianship in an access-like moment with my brother Dave, who was a digital librarian at Simon Fraser at the time. In 1995, we were in England. We were walking over the hills of Herefordshire. And he told me, I was at that point thinking of getting into digital publishing, which meant CD-ROMs, because they're so cool. And he told me they were networking their CD-ROMs in the library so that users could access them, all at the same time. And that sounded so much cooler than anything I had associated with librarianship up to then, that I was drawn in. And that could easily have been an Access talk. If we had recorded it and put up some slides, that's what it would have been. The history of Access has been told once before at Access in 2013. Roy Tennant gave a great talk of sort of personal reminiscence of Access and also digital archaeology of it, trying to dig the history off the web to tell it again. It survives in a great video on YouTube, which you could have watched up until 6 o'clock on Friday evening. When I went in at 8 o'clock on Friday evening to review it, because I needed to look at it again for this talk, it had been blocked for copyright infringement. Apparently it includes A Hard Day's Night. I think he must have played a clip from his previous video of the early Hackfest, where I think he used A Hard Day's Night in the soundtrack. So that's gone unless we can get it out of YouTube's hands and scrub the audio, or unless anyone here from Access 2013 still has the original. Let's talk. But yeah, Roy's point about the digital history of it was shit disappears, and it did. So I wanted to just quickly look at the earliest history. We know there was an Access conference in 1995. There's some dispute about what was the first Access conference. 1995 was Fredericton, and it was called the Access Conference. But 1994 in St. John's was clearly a predecessor. It was the same people, some continuity, and the web was just text at that time. This account of it survives, I think, at its original URL, continuously served. But 1993, something happened in Winnipeg. You can see, what is it? The Access 9X conferences, which began in Winnipeg in 1993. As near as I can tell, there was something possibly vendor-hosted dealing with WebSpur's Silver Platter CD-ROMs. But I do not have the details, and if anybody does, I haven't properly tried to do the oral history of this yet, but hopefully someday we will work out exactly what happened there. But it all got going. And it developed a culture of its own. And I thought I would get off the tech track onto the cultural track. This is music at Access. These are the Dukes of Earl in 1996, when Dukes of URL was funny because it was kind of new. And that's Dave on the right with all the beard. They played. By 2002, we had poetry, and obviously no cultural life is possible without poetry. A poem lost or left behind at a poetry slam in 2002 was then posted on a slide in 2003. So already we were looking at our history and trying to preserve what we could. But I wanted to get into some trends that I've worked out. I've pulled all of the old programs into spreadsheets and dumped them out and done a lot of parsing. And I'll be putting those in a GitHub repository so other people can follow along if they want to. So one thing I noticed, this graph, I hope it's reasonably visible, shows the total speaking time at each Access conference. And you can see the total time being occupied with words has been going down. We've moved away from the 2.5 days to 2 days with or without Hackfest. And at the same time, the talks are getting shorter. So the total minutes per talk used to hang out between 30 and 45. It's now getting down close to 20 with these little talks that we've done. And I'm sure the other organizers have been responding to the same urge that we did of trying to keep the, trying to get in as many papers as possible. We got so many good proposals. This one, the gender distribution. This is based on parsing, using a open source library that guesses gender based on first name. So it won't be entirely accurate, but pretty close. For the first 3/4 of the history of the conference, it went along with about 3/4 of the speaking time going to men and 1/4 to women. That's men in red at the top, women at in blue at the bottom. And then suddenly it changed, and it's been more or less in parity for the last few years. Can anyone guess what happened at the point where that changed? Anyone here from the 2013 organizers? Peer review, blind peer review of submissions had that almost immediate effect. So as a guy who was on an organizing committee back in the old 75-25 days, I was part of the problem, and it took a systemic change to get my nefarious influence out of there. So this is a good thing, and so I love the way this graph showed it so clearly. How am I doing? Sorry. Okay. I was also curious to investigate the Code for Lib effect. So the Code for Lib organization based in the US started in 2006 working off of the Access model, but they were ahead of us on getting into blind peer review. And when they decided to hold their own conference in 2006 in Corvallis in Oregon, there was concern on the Access side that Americans who had been coming to Access for years would stop coming, and what effect would this have on the Access community? Some of the great personalities who were at Access every year would not be there anymore. And I was interested to see that the number of speakers we have has gone up fairly dramatically for each year. These are not actual, I'm not counting human beings, but speaking slots here. So if the same person gave a lightning talk and a regular talk at the same conference, they count twice. And if, I think I haven't pulled the numbers on it, but I think we do have a trend toward more multi-speaker talks as we go along. So the American contribution and participation did not diminish that much in numbers from what it had been before, but certainly as a proportion of the growing number of speakers at each conference, it has fallen from near parity to a much smaller group, which is a shame. I think we miss some people. I miss some people who used to be regulars here. So that's, in about 7 minutes, that was the history that I have to tell. I think there is a lot more that would be worth digging into. I've, as I say, I'll be sharing the parsed files of the programs, and there's a suggestion in on the Hackfest schedule for tomorrow that someone might want to pick up and work on to do more processing of those old programs, and no doubt other interesting trends will emerge when that happens. However, we can't get away from the fact that has been mentioned more than once in this conference, that we are living in the midst of a climate emergency that we ignore at our peril. A few months ago, this study was released. This is from a couple of geographers at the University of Victoria, studying the effects of business travel at the University of British Columbia, and concluding, not very surprisingly, that there is an awful lot of effect on the climate from the travel that brings us to conferences. The carbon footprint is dramatic. So let me get into that. Here are the Access conferences that have been held going back to 93, and for the ones where we have programs, so starting around 95, I've got circles representing the average distance that a speaker traveled to get to the Access conference. It's interesting to see that you get small circles around Southern Ontario and larger circles in the rest of the country. I assume that's because when the conference is in Vancouver, a lot of people fly from Halifax, and therefore the averages go up, whereas if it's in the middle of the country, more people fly, but they fly shorter distances. But those circles are big. The amount of travel that represents is a little scary. I broke it down a little further by plotting the home institutions of the 151 people who are registered for Access this year. And the red circles are, the area of the circle is proportionate to the number of people from that city. So Edmonton is the big red circle. Other cities have contributed fewer. 5 minutes, okay. The black circle is 500 kilometers out from Edmonton. So let's say the people within that circle drove here, the people outside it flew here. On that basis, 151 people, plotting it out for all of the cities they came to Edmonton from, and assuming they are going home to the same city, that's 352,000 kilometers of travel to bring us all together here. 8,000 of those kilometers are inside the black circle, leaving 296,000 kilometers of flight. That is about 7.5 times around the equator. I didn't come up with a good number representing the carbon footprint of that amount of flying, but let's just say it is not negligible. So we got to do better than that. As the Victoria report says, we've got to stop meeting like this. And there are alternatives. The Cool Institute here at University of Alberta, did it do it? Did it take it? Yeah, okay, good. Has been sponsoring an international digital humanities conference for a number of years that works by people getting together in one place at lots of institutions around the world and presenting over a digital feed so that each node has a time slot, and they give 3 or 4 presentations, and then they hand over to the next node. They follow the time zones around the world, and the experience is as good as you can get from a digital feed, plus a few people in the room watching a digital feed. That's not as good as the experience I've had here the last couple of days, but is it good enough? And can we do it well? Can we really make that work? I think we really do need to try. Here's what it would look like if we had 4 of these nodes, say, in Halifax, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. There is not a lot of red circle space outside of those 4 nodes. So the amount of flying on this basis, I didn't run the numbers, but it would be drastically reduced from what it was to get us here today. So I'm hopeful that future Access organizers will, that we as a community can get together to make this work, to figure out how to reduce the carbon footprint by not flying. Yeah, 2 minutes. And that's basically it. I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people helped with the data input for this. We started, I think it was at the 2014 conference. Someone got talking about Access history, and we set up a Google Sheet when Google Sheets were new, and people started copying and pasting stuff in. And that was a lot of fun. And then I filled it out over the last couple of weeks. And when I ran out of time on the weekend, my wife Liz helped a lot, which got me here. So I hope there are comments or questions on this.
Does anybody have any questions for Peter?
I want there to be discussion. Not related to any specific points you brought up, but just personally, as you looked back over this history of a conference with which you've had a long relationship, what surprised you most in what you've discovered? What most challenged your preconceived beliefs, I guess, of what Access is or could be?
I didn't have preconceptions really, because I went to my first Access in Guelph before I came out to Edmonton to start my first job. So I was at Access before I was at work. And so it has been really formative for me that way. I guess the success in maintaining itself and keeping it going forward, in expressing what I think really is a shared community commitment to helping each other get better at what we do. I think a big part of that has been the single stream format. So I've felt it this year that you follow along on Twitter, you talk to people, and it's a single conversation that builds over the 2 days or whatever of the conference. And at the end of it, we've all heard the same things. We've all experienced some of the same things, and we're all prepared to move ahead talking to each other about this and being able to refer back to, remember it at Access, they said. So as an expression of a community trying to work together, I think it has been exemplary. And I would hate to break that up by messing with that formula, even though we have to.
Anybody else? Questions? Oh, yeah.
This isn't my question exactly. Somebody on Twitter asked it, but I'm going to stand up and ask it. Do you recall when the Code of Conduct was implemented? I know we had one in Newfoundland, but did we have one before that? Was Montreal?
Yeah.
Was Montreal the first one?
I would go with Montreal until someone comes up with evidence, but yeah, I think that would make sense. So that was 2012, yeah.
We also had blind peer review.
Did you? Okay, so I'm off by at least a year. And it was actually blind then, and that's okay. Well, then my graph shows an interesting lag between the introduction of blind peer review and the gender parity that ultimately resulted. It would be interesting to dig into that.
How does one plan a pub crawl and trivia night in a multi-node virtual conference?
Yeah, like I've got all the answers. I don't know, trivia could be done. And I think if we can get good pubs with really good beer and we describe to each other in free verse or in sonnets or any poetic expression over the digital connection, I think that will help to maintain the community spirit.
All right. Anyone else? That's great. Thanks so much, Peter.